Hi, this is Travis Shaw with the Mosby Heritage Area Association, here to introduce today's program on the 1st South Carolina Volunteers African Descent. They were one of the first African American regiments to fight for the United States cause during the Civil War. Now, although to our knowledge they do not contain any local soldiers within their ranks, their experience was somewhat indicative or somewhat typical for African American soldiers during the American Civil War. The African American contributions to the Union war effort cannot be underestimated. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans from both North and South would serve in the United States Army or in the United States Navy, making up about 10% of the Army's forces and nearly a quarter of the enlisted men in the Navy by 1865. So it's an incredible contribution. That contribution will begin in 1862 as various states started allowing the recruitment of African American volunteers. You'll start to see early units like the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, the subject of today's talk, the 1st South Carolina, the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment, made famous by the movie Glory. That trickle of African American volunteers would become a flood in 1863 after the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which not only freed slaves in the rebellious states, but also allowed for the recruiting, widespread recruiting of African Americans for the Army and the formation of what were known as the United States Colored Troops, or USCT regiments. By the end of the war, there are around 175 USCT regiments, and many, many men from the Heritage area, from here in Northern Virginia, would serve in those regiments. We don't have an exact number. The research is still being done. Local historian Kevin Grigsby has done an excellent study that has identified at least 250 African Americans from Loudoun County alone, which would indicate that this total number from the Heritage area would be in the hundreds. These soldiers not only faced the typical hardships that all soldiers faced in the Civil War, of course, the constant danger of being killed or wounded in battle, the danger of dying of disease or by accidents, but they also faced a lot of hardships from their own comrades within the United States Army. Many white soldiers from the North were not pleased to see African American men fight. They faced a lot of racism from other volunteers from the North and from the government itself. African American soldiers were not paid the same as white volunteers initially. African American troops were often relegated to hardship duties that white troops would not do. Things like, digging trenches, digging fortifications, hauling equipment and supplies from one place to another. It was not until several African American regiments really proved their bravery and their worth on the battlefield that they could fight just as hard as their white counterparts that they were really accepted as kind of equal volunteers within the United States Army. And African American troops would play an incredibly important role in the siege of Port Hudson, the battles along the Gulf Coast and the Southeast Coast, the Sea Islands off of Georgia and South Carolina, and probably most importantly at battles like the Battle of Nashville and the eventual fall of Richmond, the siege of Petersburg. African American troops were present at these battles in large numbers and would help to secure Union victory in the closing campaigns of 1864 and 1865. They, of course, also faced another danger that their white counterparts did not, and that was retribution at the hands of Confederate authorities. In May 1863, the Confederate Congress actually passed a law saying that any black soldiers in the Union Army and any of their white officers who were captured in battle would be considered guilty of inciting slave insurrection and would be put to death. And this would occur on the battlefield at places like Fort Pillow, Saltville, and Olustee, Florida. So despite all of these hardships, as I said before, nearly 200,000 African Americans would volunteer and would put their lives on the line for the cause of liberty and the cause of emancipation and for the cause of preserving the Union. And today we're going to take a deep look at one of those regiments. That is the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Our guest today, Millicent Hughes, had an ancestor who actually served as an officer in this regiment. Again, like with all these USCT regiments, they were officered by white men, but the enlisted men, many of the non-commissioned officers and so forth, were African American. So through her research, she's done a tremendous amount of research into the life of her ancestor, into his papers and letters, and into the experiences of what it was like to actually command one of these regiments during the war and many of the hardships that they faced both on and off the battlefield. So it is with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce our guest today, Millicent Hughes. Thank you so much for being here, Millicent.
Hi, I'm Millicent Hughes, and I'm here in the Mosby Heritage area, wonderful Rector House, sitting in front of the fireplace. And I want to share a story about a subject that has really come to the fore lately, and that is African Americans and their history. Specifically, I want to talk about the first African American troops that fought for the Union in the Civil War. And it might be a more interesting story than you think, because a lot of this was illegal, and it's kind of fun. So I'm going to start with a slide deck and sharing the slides that have pictures of some of the real people that are involved in this. But first, just a little background. In 1861, the U.S. Navy under Admiral Samuel DuPont came down to the Sea Islands, and that they wanted to blockade Charleston and Savannah, but they thought they would just conquer the Sea Islands because nobody was there to resist. The Sea Islands were composed of large plantations the Confederate owners had run to the mainland and left hundreds and hundreds of slave workers there with no direction, nothing to do. And the abolitionists in the North had known that this was going to happen, and they had planned for it. Religious groups such as Gideon's Band, combined with teachers, combined with businessmen who would be capable of making something of these plantations that could benefit the Union, all combined together with the United States Treasury. And this formed the Port Royal experiment, sometimes called the Port Royal Experience. I thought I'd split the difference. But this was a large undertaking, and it had, as you see, government backing, but we also had the military on the scene. General Rufus Saxton was the military commander, and then General David Hunter had another role. He was the head of the Department of the South. Now, what exact rights this gave him was always a little fuzzy, especially to him. So as we go on in our tale, a contest was brewing for these able-bodied men on the plantations. And profits would go, of the farms that they planned, profits would go to support the workers and the volunteers, and the overage would go back to the Union. Teachers came to spread literacy, superintendents came to mobilize workers and administer their work. But the two forces, military and non-military, began to oppose each other head on. And who knew what would happen with the actual inhabitants? Many lies had been told to the slaves about the Union. For example, that Union men had tails, just like the devil, and also that any soldiers that fought for the Union would be put in the front lines as cannon fodder, not to mention the possibility of being sold to Cuba. Now, on the military side, this was all sub rosa. None of it could be official. There was no official permission to gather and form Black troop, regiments, or even a squad. The idea of Black troops had been presented to Lincoln by General Hunter, and he refused to consider it. But nothing official didn't mean nothing. And General Hunter began to collect people, recruit people to join this rather cloudy force that he was forming. He did manage to get one group of 60 to 80 to form a company of a regiment, and what to do with them. He had the ideal person, his orderly. Now his orderly, you will see in the front, the first slide that I have, was a relative of mine. And when I heard this story, I couldn't resist even the picture of the man, because he looked so fascinating. None of the people that were gathered for this regiment, supposed regiment, could read, write, or even speak understandably because they spoke a form of Gullah. A God-fearing New York stonemason and building contractor from the 1st New York Volunteers seemed to be the ideal person to lead such a group, right? Let's share my screen and you can see his picture, and we can continue on with the slides. There you are. Charles Tyler Trowbridge in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, Company A. But you have to understand that none of this was real. This was just all in their minds. And so Charles Trowbridge, a person who looked most suited to the offensive line of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a person of no particular education or military background, an irresistible personality with a bullhorn roar if you did resist. He was only a sergeant, but he was only that because he was the general's orderly. First qualification, be large enough to remove an injured general from the battlefield if necessary. He fit the bill. No one knew what would happen if white men began to order these inhabitants, these African-American men, around. Would they follow orders after their life experiences with white masters? But the men got a kick out of Charles' drills and he performed very well. They also were working to build housing for themselves and other inhabitants there at Port Royal. Camp Saxton, named after General Saxton. The Port Royal area covered from Beaufort all the way up to Hilton Head. So Trowbridge's company became useful very soon. They built until the 1st of August, when the rumor of rebel scouts on St. Simon's Island came to General Saxton's ears, and Company A was delegated to go down and solve the problem. The stonemason sergeant from New York was constituted a captain. His brother John was made a lieutenant. Another lieutenant was procured, and they all boarded a mailboat for the island carrying guns. Well, no, picks and shovels, but the officers had guns, and the rebels were driven off to the relief of the locals, who now had a much better impression of the newcomers than was had back at Camp Saxton, where more press gang tactics and nasty officers resulted in the complete abandonment of any effort to enlist Black men as soldiers or anything else. General Hunter sent out an edict freeing all former slaves, only to have Lincoln telegraph back that Hunter had absolutely no right to do that. True, but confusing and dispiriting to all. What was this all for? So 2 months went by with the troops over on St. Simon's Island. But they were 2 months with no orders, no money, no supplies ever came. Trowbridge feared that they had been forgotten. News from the mainland said that Generals Hunter and Saxton were leaving. Who even knew they were on St. Simon's Island? But when he returned to Camp Saxton, Trowbridge reported no mutiny, no disease, and more men than he had left camp with. The generals were amazed. Back at the ranch, Camp Saxton, Reverend French, who was heading up the Port Royal experiment, returned from a trip he took to Washington, D.C., to convince Lincoln that he had to have Black soldiers. And sure enough, he had permission from Defense Secretary Stanton for 5,000 new recruits. How did he do it when General Hunter couldn't? He took everybody's favorite slave. Here's just a little bit more. This just tells what happened on St. Simon's. They drove the rebels off. Oh, and that's signed by Susie King Taylor. How did a woman get into this? Well, we'll meet Susie later. Now here this shows the situation of the troops, his own men poorly clothed and hardly shod at all, no uniforms provided. They grew more and more ragged, no pay. We'll hear that again too. And here we hear that General Saxton has the authority to organize 5,000 troops, and Charles Trowbridge will be the senior captain of the 1st Regiment. Now, how did Reverend French get permission for these new recruits? Why, he took Robert Smalls with him to Washington. Many, including the abolitionists and religious, did not believe that slaves had executive ability and ambition until Robert Smalls came along. It made headlines all over the North when an illiterate slave planned and executed the 1862 version of The Great Escape. He stole a 147-foot coastal freighter and gave it to the Union. He also made best friends with Admiral Samuel DuPont. So this was how Robert Smalls got to go to Washington, because the important part to Reverend French, who you would think would be against having soldiers, was that there be regular regiments, not illicit fly-by-night recruiting with threats, upfront and legal, which so far Company A was not. But first, there was also the concern of what would happen with Black soldiers in battle. Would they hang back or run? If you faced them against Confederates, would they just automatically shoot and kill every Confederate that they could find anywhere, including in towns? And this stonemason captain, he didn't know anything about fighting either, especially not covert naval operations. It seemed like First South needed a real colonel, but if a colonel was officially assigned, a failure might look really bad for the Army and certainly for that colonel. So a baseline for finding one was that the colonel not be professional Army. Maybe the best thing to do was to test the troops before any colonels showed up. So an officer was borrowed from a New York regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Beard, and he was a person very capable of riverine invasions. So he did a couple. Now here is his report on the men. They were going to go down the coast on the ship Darlington, which you see up there on the left, and try a little robbery. Because part of the plan was that these were not cavalry scouting expeditions or little sallies by a few of the Green Mountain Boys. These forays required naval freight boats with gunboats covering, complete with real rebels and real shooting. The object was robbing salt, lumber, and contrabands. Just coming back alive was not going to be a form of success. But the troops got rave reviews. Oliver Beard says, the colored men fought with astonishing coolness and bravery, for alacrity in effecting landings, for determination, and for bushfighting. I found them all I could desire, more than I hoped. They behaved bravely, gloriously, and deserved all praise. I started from St. Simon's with 62 fighting men and returned to Beaufort with 156, all colored. As soon as we took a slave from his claimant, we placed a musket in his hand and he began to fight for the freedom of others. Their next little event, Colonel Beard talks about fighting for a causeway. Up on the left, you see a picture of Company A on the left driving the rebels off of this causeway that they had to cross in order to get their goods. I think you cannot fail to give them great praise for standing a galling fire from a concealed enemy so bravely and for holding the causeway referred to during the 2 days and nights required for loading 2 large steamers in the face of an enemy. To do this, my men worked day and night without intermission, and though short of provisions, I heard not a murmur. Kind of amusing that he says, Captain Trowbridge aided me greatly. Captain Crandall of the Darlington I found a trifling childish pest. Now down there on the bottom, you see a picture of the Ben de Ford. Now the Ben de Ford was not a freighter, it was actually a transport ship. So you put those 156 people on the transport ship, and then the Darlington took the load. So we come to the choosing of real colonels. They deserved it. But where do you find a man used to skirmish fighting, hardened to battle losses, and yet an ardent and religious abolitionist, accustomed to running a regiment in the Army? Thomas Wentworth Higginson had formed a white New England regiment, 51st Massachusetts, some months before, and termed himself captain. He had the sense to enlist a genuine colonel, a Colonel Sprague. Thomas Higginson had proven able enough at getting into and out of trouble, into being quite on purpose, when he was in the Kansas Wars years earlier. You all remember the war in Kansas, right? Now, they were forming another regiment, the 2nd South Carolina, and so they needed another colonel too. Here's Reverend Higginson, and indeed he was a reverend. He was ejected from several New England churches for approving violence in support of abolition. Now, here's a quote from him. Whoever in our regiment falls into the hands of the rebels, there is a tacit understanding that we are not to surrender under any circumstances. And here's another candidate. He was also a veteran of the war in Kansas. Or was he doing service or just plain thuggery? He maintained that if only idle threats were issued, no one would believe them, which might have been true. This is Colonel James Montgomery. Well, we should mention some of the things he's famous for. The brigade was notorious for its terrorist actions. Osceola, Kansas was plundered and burned to the ground. 200 slaves were freed, but 9 local citizens executed. Montgomery practiced burn-it-down warfare while looting anything loose. In June of 1863, Montgomery commanded his own 2nd South Carolina and the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery in the raid at Combahee Ferry, in which 800 slaves were freed with the help of Harriet Tubman, of a recent movie, I understand. Now, besides the domestic terrorists, which is what Colonel Montgomery was, there's also domestic animal terrorism, and I found amusing Colonel Higginson's description of a trip that Colonel Montgomery took with his troops. In Colonel Montgomery's hands, these upriver raids reached the dignity of a fine art. His conceptions of foraging were rather more Western and liberal than mine. I remember being on the wharf with some naval officers when he came down from his first trip. The steamer seemed an animated hen coop. Live poultry hung from the foremast shrouds, dead ones from the mainmast, geese hissed from the binnacle, a pig paced the quarterdeck, and duck's wings were seen fluttering from a line which was wont to sustain duck trousers. The naval heroes, mindful of their own short rations and taking high views of duties in a conquered country, looked at me reproachfully. Now, where on earth did they find these people? Non-regular Army individuals, religious men who would stop at nothing. Here's just a little bit about the war in Kansas. Bloody Kansas was a series of violent civil confrontations between 1854 and 1861, which emerged from the debate over legality of slavery in the proposed state of Kansas. Missouri was a state and was pro-slavery. Kansas was not a state, it was a territory, but it was going to be a state. The conflict was characterized by years of electoral fraud, raids, assaults, and retributive murders carried out in Kansas and neighboring Missouri. The conflict degenerated into gang violence and paramilitary guerrilla warfare with officers of their own invention. Thus, Colonel Montgomery was actually a colonel when he came to 2nd Regiment. Such was the prequel to the Civil War that supplied the two new colonels of the 1st and 2nd South Carolina regiments, Thomas Wentworth Higginson and James Montgomery. Now, as soon as Colonel Higginson came, he had to do an expedition of his own, but he still couldn't plan it himself. A Corporal Robert Sutton had a little score to settle with his old plantation. Higginson's admiration for Sutton's planning ability was boundless, although Sutton, like many of them, could neither read nor write. Like Smalls, Sutton had been a river pilot and knew the waters, which sometimes appeared far too narrow for the large boats considered for the trip. Here on the right, we meet Robert Small's boat, which was most definitely invited. Robert piloted a lot of naval vessels, but the planter had to be given up to the quartermaster department because it was wood burning. The Navy men just couldn't deal with anything so old that it took wood. So they had to give the boat to those landlubbers. Eventually, Robert returned to the planter and took it up for a refit with a coal-fired engine. While he was there, he got a little refit of his own, which we will talk about later. Now, the planter was definitely invited to up the St. Mary's River with Robert Sutton and Colonel Higginson, but the poor planter was in such bad condition that she was late to the party, and Captain Trowbridge was left to go on his own. Of course, on his own merely meant retracing the steps of the last expedition with Lieutenant Colonel Beard. But in this, it talks about where they went up the same river and managed to go even farther and destroyed assault works. They ended up at Kings Bay, and the good work they had done there the first time had stayed done, so they just went on. So that was a very successful trip on all sorts, and there were more trips to come up the St. Johns River, up the Edisto. But let's go back to Camp Saxton. There were a lot of spirits that were willing, but many things were weak. So let's visit some of the other people that were concerned. One wonderful thing about 1st South Carolina was everybody wrote. Colonel Higginson wrote for the Atlantic magazine, which was why he ended up writing several books and many journals about the Civil War. But also, here's the camp doctor, Dr. Seth Rogers. Now, when people wrote letters home in those days, they would, of course, be read by the family, and then they would be taken to newspapers. And they became literally public documents, later perhaps to be enclosed in books. I only just finished reading Letters from the Port Royal Experiment a wonderful book of letters from all the superintendents and teachers to each other. So this is what he sent home. In our camp, the most curious problems present themselves. How to keep people from scurvy without vegetables and fresh meat. How to have a good fire in tents without a fireplace, stove, or ventilation. How to make bread without yeast and without an oven. How to treat the sick without medicines. How to amputate limbs without knives. All these and many other similarly knotty questions the surgeon of the 1st Regiment of South Carolina Volunteers has to consider, sometimes when he ought to be sleeping. So we met the doctor, let's meet the nurse. Susie Baker was 14 years old. Susie had an interesting history. She had lived in Savannah with her grandmother, where she had been sent to one of these secret schools that many of the city-colored had. And she had learned to read, but you got kicked out of that school when you were about 11 or 12, old enough to do whatever business at stores you needed to know how to do. But she insisted she wanted to learn more, and her grandmother ended up paying the landlord's teenage son to teach Susie. But at 14, her schooling ended, and she was taken by her uncle to St. Simon's Island towards the Yankees with a boatload of refugees. On the boat, her ability to read attracted the captain's attention, and she began to teach school after the captain remarked to some of the people from the Port Royal experience that, well, he knew a little girl that could help out with all those little children they said were just running around unsupervised. And Susie writes, he, Trowbridge, found me at Gaston Bluff teaching my little school and was much interested in it. Enrolled as an Army laundress, she nursed, cooked, and taught reading, one of only 3 women in camp. She married a sergeant in Company A. In order to be a sergeant, by the way, you had to know how to read and write. Those were the only 2 requirements. Hers is, at least supposedly, the only book about the Civil War written by an actual participant, as opposed to a person like Laura Town, who was a teacher over at Port Royal and also wrote about it. I wonder what Susie got paid for doing this duty. I gave my services willingly for 4 years and 3 months without receiving $1. I was glad, however, to be allowed to go with the regiment to care for the sick and afflicted comrades. Remember the part about Susie was enrolled as a laundress? Yes, well, they didn't qualify for pensions, too bad, or anything else. Now, Charles Trowbridge, later in life, after Susie wrote her book, directed this letter to her. The manuscript of the story of your Army life reached me today. I've read it with much care and interest, and am most willingly and cordially endorse it as a truthful account of your unselfish devotion and service through more than 3 long years of war, in which the 33rd Regiment bore a conspicuous part in the great conflict for human liberty and the restoration of the Union. I most sincerely regret that through a technicality you were debarred from having your name placed on the roll of pensioners as an Army nurse, for among all the number of heroic women whom the government is now rewarding, I know of no one more deserving than yourself. Well, at least the soldiers got paid, right? And maybe not. From day one, carrying picks and shovels, Company A moved on to being regularly enrolled as the 33rd U.S. Colored Troops, except that they never received the same wages as whites. Urged by their officers, they refused to accept this. Unequal pay, wrote Colonel Higginson of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, has inflicted untold suffering, has impaired discipline, has relaxed loyalty, and has begun to implant a feeling of sullen distrust. One quiet protest resulted in the protester being shot by a firing squad. Not until 1864 was this situation rectified. Remember, it was May 1862 when we started this with Company A? Now there were other trips up the St. John's. There was a trip to Florida that was somewhat abortive because after Higginson got control of Jacksonville, for no known reason, they were told to pack up and go back to Camp Saxton. There was also a trip in which Higginson was severely wounded and he had to retire for some time. But here was another chance to go to Florida. But General Saxton had some type of a feeling about it. Was it because he knew the people involved that would be leading it, General Seymour and General Gilmore? Who knew? Then General Saxton, as anxious to keep us as was the regiment to go, paid his last card in smallpox. Oh, wow, here's another virus. For smallpox is indeed a virus, not a bacteria. This should be great interest for everybody today. General Saxton telegraphed to the department headquarters that we had smallpox dangerously in the regiment. Then the order came to embark the next day for Florida. Great was the jubilee. By 8, the whole camp was demolished or put in wagons, and we were on our way. We went to work at the wharf. Vast wagon loads of tents, rations, ordnance, and whatnot disappeared into the capacious maw of the Delaware, their ship. In the midst of it all came riding down General Saxton with a dispatch. If you think the amount of smallpox in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers is sufficient, the order will be countermanded. And Higginson said, say that we are on board already and the smallpox left behind. Say we only had 13 cases, chiefly varioid, and 10 almost well. Our blood was up with a tremendous morning's work done, and rather than turn back, we felt ready to hold down Major General Gilmore and all his staff and vaccinate them by main force. So General Saxton rode off and we worked away. Just as the last wagon load but one was being transferred to the depths of the Delaware, down rode the general with fiendish joy in his bright eyes and held out a paper from headquarters. The marching orders of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers are hereby countermanded. I sincerely hope the regiment would never behave after a defeat as they behaved then. Every man seemed crushed, officers and soldiers alike. When they broke ranks, they went and lay down like sheep wherever their tents used to be. In the Florida campaign, the instructions to General Seymour were to remain on the coast. But after easy successes, General Seymour met an equal-sized force of 5,000 entrenched Confederates, complete with artillery. The Union retreated toward Jacksonville with heavy losses. The Confederates did make a final attempt to engage the rear element of Seymour's forces just before nightfall, but they were repulsed by elements of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. That would have been Colonel Shaw's under Colonel Hallowell after Colonel Shaw was killed at Fort Wagner. And the 35th United States Colored Troops under Colonel Montgomery, both composed of black soldiers. The Confederate cavalry commander received criticism for failing to pursue the retreating Union forces and instead killing the wounded black soldiers. Back in Camp Saxton, a few surgeons went hastily to and fro as if conscience-stricken, and we all stood wondering. General Saxton strode hastily down the hall, his pale face resolute, looking almost sick with anxiety. He had just been on board the steamer. There were 250 wounded men just arrived. But for a few trivial cases of varioloid, we should certainly have been in that disastrous fight. We were confidently expected for several days at Jacksonville, and we, being the oldest colored regiment, would have had right of the line. the right of the line means you get to face the opposing army first. Soldiers on both sides were veterans of the great battles of the Eastern and Western theaters of war, but many of them remarked in letters and diaries that they had never experienced such terrible fighting. So this was the last big thing, not going to USCT. It was the best thing that had ever happened to the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. Well, COVID cautious audience, once again, the virus seems to have won out. And smallpox is a variola virus. Citizens who wanted to minimize fear of it called it variola. There was, of course, smallpox vaccination at that time, but some did not believe in it. Live virus could kill you, and much of their vaccination was done that way. You couldn't always find cowpox when you needed it. When Lincoln had variola, his servant caught it from him and died. Higginson retired after an injury that never resolved. He had a happy life writing books and editing Emily Dickinson's poems. Susie Taylor's husband died, and she had to enter service as a maid, but was taken north every year by her very kind employers. And in Boston, she married well at the age of 31 and devoted the rest of her life to charity work with veterans. The regiment went on under Trowbridge. A colonel was appropriated, but he belonged to another brigade, and he never came because he was filling in for the sick general of that brigade until he was made a general. Everything was just left to Trowbridge, who stayed until the war ended. Then he moved to the Freedmen's Bureau for further amazing adventures and to undergo court-martials twice. Stay tuned. Robert Smalls, when his boat got refitted, he got refitted in Philadelphia too. He found a school teacher, not just any school teacher, and learned to read and write and debate. The school teacher fitted him for the South Carolina House of Representatives, to be a South Carolina state senator, and 3 times elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And our last slide is about Higginson's version of Charles Tyler Trowbridge and what he contributed to the whole program. He was a magnificent specimen of men of moderate training and early disadvantage, out of whom the Civil War made heroes. A thoroughly trained mechanic, large and strong, with a stentorian voice, a fine ear for music, and a fearless dispositions. Gifts and qualities he retained to the end of his life, and which were thoroughly appreciated by Negro soldiers, and which I fully esteemed when he came under my command. And that, folks, is the story of how we got started with the first company of the 1st Regiment of African American troops. And thank you so much for listening, and hope you stay tuned in case I get to come back and we'll talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. Thanks now.